Welcome to our channel. Today we're making an Alpsungle bread, a very delicious bread that our Pixie introduced during the Germany tour. Made from 3 different types of flour, it looks like this. Wonderful in taste, keeps fresh for a long time. The special thing is it uses a very long pre-dough. Surprisingly hearty. For our Alpsungle, we need wheat flour, spelt flour, and rye flour. But the Alpsungle itself is built with a long pre-dough, and that's why I separate the flours. Here in the bowl is my wheat flour for the pre-dough. Furthermore, I need yeast for the main dough, yeast for the pre-dough, salt, a little bit of salt in the pre-dough, hence my salt shaker, just a small amount, just a pinch, and the total water divided, a smaller amount for the pre-dough and the larger amount for the main dough. And most importantly, my wooden spoon. My pre-dough is what's called a long pre-dough, and this bread, in quotation marks, really depends on it. Here, using 200 grams of flour and 120 grams of water from the total amount, a bit of yeast and a little salt, I make my pre-dough. I've attached a small note to my water measuring jug here, and I recommend you do the same because you need to divide the amount. And it's incredibly helpful to know which pot contains which amount, because they don't really look that different. But the amounts have to be correct. So note off, first I take my salt shaker, a small pinch of salt, that's all it needs, but it's important to activate the gluten in the flour. Then I take my yeast, crumble it into the water I need for the pre-dough, just mix it a little so the yeast dissolves. And then comes something important, you have a second pot here. If you now mix the pre-dough in this small pot here with a spoon like I have, it's difficult to hold the pot. So, for the time being, I briefly put my flour into a larger pot that I can handle better. Now I add my water with the yeast. And now I just need a minute, that's all it takes. I'm just stirring, I hope you can see it well with the top camera. I'm simply mixing the yeast with the water here in the pot. And you can already see I can really grab this pot. That means I can really work well with it here. You don't have to get too fancy with it. It doesn't need to become a dough. It just needs to be mixed together, just like I'm doing here. Maybe just separate it briefly one more time. If you want, you can also knead it a little by hand until everything is really incorporated. But the whole advantage comes from the fact that it eventually starts to ferment and the swelling process begins here as well. And that's why what I'm doing here is already enough. You see, I don't have any loose components left, at least no big ones. That's the advantage. Dough. Now the dough goes back into my pot. Why this pot, you might ask? I can tell you because I can seal it wonderfully. I just set it aside at room temperature for 24 hours, sealed. Let it sit like that. This is how it looks now, and I'll show you what it looks like after a day. During that time, it develops a wonderful aroma, but that's not enough to make the whole bread rise on its own afterwards. You still need to add a bit of yeast afterwards, but that's completely normal, and even then we're only using a relatively small amount, so there's really not much in it. All right, now it gets to rest for a day. Now we'll prepare the main dough. What do we do for that? It's very simple. I add the salt to my flour and mix it a little, specifically into the rye and spelt flour, which is in here now, because my wheat flour is already in the pre-dough. I take the yeast, which I still need for the entire dough, crumble it a bit into my water here, and dissolve it a little so that everything distributes better. This is very important. So now I first add the water to my bowl. But in this case, with all of the yeast, otherwise none of this will work. The flour with the salt mixture, and finally I add the pre-dough on top. And after 24 hours, the pre-dough looks like this. And that's exactly how it should look. You can see how nicely it's bubbling, how well it has developed. Now it gets mixed in here, and believe me, it gives the bread a wonderful character. And by the way, a beautiful crumb structure. Yes, that's actually pretty much everything that happens during the dough preparation. I hope you can see it. Now I'm taking it out of the bowl. It's just as it should be. It smells wonderful. I'd say we can make a great bread out of this. I'm going to knead it now for 5 minutes on medium speed, and then this dough will rest for an hour and a half. That always depends a bit on the room temperature. Here in our room, it's pleasantly warm. I think it will be ready in an hour. Then it goes into the dough resting phase, and after that, we'll continue processing it. The dough has now finished 5 minutes of kneading. I just want to show you again what it looks like. As always with my doughs, I really like them when they're silky and soft, and that's exactly how this one is. You can already see how nicely it can be worked with. Resting phase. Covered. Pause. The dough for our Alpsungel has now rested for 55 minutes. You can clearly see that it has developed well. That's exactly how it should be. We'll just set it aside for now. Now I'm not going to do much at all. I take the dough out and divide it into 2 equal parts. You don't even need to weigh it, you can just eyeball it. I can guarantee you there won't be much difference, maybe just a few grams. Well, and now I stretch and fold it a little. I shape it into a bit of a round, as they say. I shape it into a round, but I don't press down on it like crazy. Instead, I leave that nice rise inside, a bit undisturbed, and set it aside with the seam facing up. I do the same with this piece of dough as well. A little flour underneath so it doesn't stick. Shape it a bit round, and give it another 10 to 15 minutes to relax. This is very important here because now the yeast really gets going again. It's rising exactly in the direction it should. After all, this is supposed to become a beautiful loaf of bread later. So a few minutes to relax, cover it with a cloth so it doesn't dry out, and then we'll continue in a moment. The short resting time of 10 to 15 minutes is now over. So let's do it. If you look closely, they've spread apart a little, which they should. That also shows me that the dough is now nice and ready to be worked with further. Now I'll shape 2 long loaves from it and place them in a cloth or a baker's basket, depending on what you have. You can also use a large tea towel, place them in there with the seam facing up. The reason for this is that later I can tip them onto a board with the seam side down, place them on my baking tray, and then slide them into the oven. But that's coming up in a moment. Now let's quickly shape the 2 loaves. Here's my cloth. I dust the cloth with a little flour. That's important so the dough doesn't stick to it. What comes next is pretty simple. Just fold it over, tuck it in again, and shape it into a long loaf. A little bit of flour is good so it doesn't stick, but just a little, not too much. And now I simply shape it into a nice loaf of bread. This is what it looks like. And that's how it goes into my cloth here. I can already give it a little pull here. Then I pull it up, hopefully you can see this, so that the next loaf I place next to it doesn't stick to this one, dough-wise. And we'll do the same thing here again, just quickly. Don't press it together too much, so it doesn't need to be squeezed together like crazy. This whole process often takes just 15 seconds in a bakery, and that's how a loaf of bread is shaped. I'm doing it a bit slower here, so you can see exactly how it's done. But this one is already finished as well. This is what it looks like, and this is how it looks from the back. That's where it goes now. I pull it up, and now I cover my loaves. I place them here in the middle. The cloth helps keep them in shape. Of course, there's a little give, but they can't spread apart. Now they'll stay here for about half an hour for the final proof, depending on the room temperature, maybe even 35, 40 minutes. It depends on how warm or cold it is where you are. And then they'll go onto the baking tray and straight into the oven. But that's the next step. The doughs have now rested here in the room for 40 minutes. They've risen nicely. They need to rise like this so they don't split open at the sides while baking. There shouldn't be too much power left in them. You can see when I press here, it leaves an indentation, but it springs back up. This is exactly the right time to put them in the oven. You can also tell because they're starting to crack open here. That's important. It's a good sign that the breads are ready to go into the oven. Now I take a board, do it like this, place the bread on it, and I do it this way so you can see it better. Here I have my baking tray and I place it nicely along the side. I do the same with the other one. You can control it perfectly like this. You can see I have them lying on the tray like this now. They have enough space between them. Now I score them diagonally 3 times. Just to show you, I'll do one like this and one with a lengthwise cut. Of course, you can also score them crosswise if you like. It's entirely up to you how you want to do it. 3 clean cuts right through here. Now they go into the oven at 220 degrees. After 10 minutes, I open the oven door to let out the steam, which I create by adding water. Let's see what comes out of it. In about 30, 35 or 38 minutes, they'll be done. Since there are 3 different types of flour, I have a wonderful mixed bread here that's nice and moist and tastes deliciously moist too. Thanks to the long pre-dough, it also stays fresh for a long time. And that's in addition to the great taste. So into the oven they go. The Alpsungul have now been in the oven for 35 minutes. I put them in at 220 degrees Celsius. After 10 minutes, I let the steam out. Then bake for another 15 minutes at 190 degrees and finish the rest at 180 degrees, lowering the temperature gradually. That's important. That way they turn out beautifully golden, just like these here. They're perfectly baked through. They're crispy if you can hear it. They smell wonderful. I hope you have as much fun baking as I always do, especially when baking it yourself. I wish you lots of success with it. As always, you'll find the recipe for our Alpsungul in the video description below. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to next time on our channel. Bye.